The morning my house became a pile of ashes, everyone believed they already knew the villain. They were wrong. I still remember the smell before I remember the flames. It was a strange mixture of wet earth, burned pine, and cold morning air that drifted through the broken window just before my eyes opened. For one confused second, I thought one of my neighbors had started an early barbecue, but then I heard the first siren echo across the valley. By the time I stepped outside, orange emergency lights were flashing across my front yard, firefighters were moving with calm precision, and the farmhouse my grandfather built more than 60 years earlier was disappearing behind thick gray smoke. I stood barefoot on damp grass, unable to say a single word as pieces of my family's history vanished in front of me. My old pickup truck sat untouched near the barn. The mailbox still leaned slightly to the left exactly as it had for years, and the giant oak tree beside the porch remained standing like a silent witness to everything that had happened. Then I heard her voice. Linda Harper never needed a microphone to command attention. She marched through the growing crowd wearing an expensive navy blazer even before sunrise, holding a folder under one arm as though she had arrived for another HOA inspection instead of a neighborhood emergency. Without asking a single question, she pointed directly at me. "This is exactly what happens when people refuse to follow community standards," she announced loudly enough for every neighbor to hear. Faces turned toward me. Some looked confused. Others looked disappointed. A few quietly stepped farther away, as though standing too close might somehow pull them into whatever story Linda was already creating. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply watched firefighters continue their work while the smell of soaked wood and smoke settled into every breath I took. Linda continued speaking with complete confidence, telling anyone willing to listen that I had ignored warnings, violated regulations, and brought unnecessary trouble into our peaceful neighborhood. Every sentence sounded polished, rehearsed, and certain. What she did not know was that certainty without facts has an expiration date. One deputy approached me politely and asked routine questions. Another handed me a small information card explaining the next steps for the investigation. I answered every question calmly, exactly as requested, never raising my voice, never pointing fingers, never accusing anyone in return. Years had taught me that emotions disappear long before official records do. Around us, neighbors whispered as television crews from a local station arrived to capture images of the burned farmhouse. Cameras focused on the ruins while Linda remained eager to speak, presenting herself as the responsible community leader facing another unfortunate resident who simply refused to cooperate. I noticed several people nodding along with her version of events because it sounded simple, and simple stories are comforting. Real stories rarely are. As the sun finally climbed above the trees, its light revealed blackened beams, broken windows, and smoke drifting slowly into a perfectly blue sky. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the familiar outline of a small key card that I carried every weekday. Nobody watching that morning knew where that card opened a door. Nobody recognized the quiet man standing beside the ashes as anything more than another unlucky homeowner. Linda certainly did not. She smiled with the confidence of someone who believed the ending had already been written. She had absolutely no idea that the most important chapter of this story would begin inside a courthouse only a few days later. I have always believed that the easiest person to underestimate is the one who never feels the need to explain himself. Long before smoke covered my property and rumors spread through the neighborhood, my life followed the same quiet rhythm every single weekday. I woke up before 5 in the morning, made a pot of black coffee, walked across the dew-covered grass to inspect the fence surrounding the old farmhouse, and fed the birds that gathered beneath the large oak tree planted by my grandfather decades earlier. The house was never impressive by modern standards. It creaked whenever strong winds crossed the valley. The paint needed refreshing every few years, and the front porch had been repaired more times than I could count. To me, none of those imperfections mattered because every board and every nail carried memories that could never be replaced. After finishing my morning routine, I usually changed into a clean button-down shirt, folded a dark suit carefully inside a garment bag, locked the front door, and drove my aging pickup truck toward the city. Most of my neighbors assumed I worked in maintenance or handled paperwork somewhere downtown because they never saw anything expensive in my driveway and never heard me discuss business over backyard conversations. I preferred it that way. Privacy has a way of protecting both your peace and your judgment. Whenever people asked what I did for a living, I usually smiled and answered that I worked at the courthouse. Technically, that answer was completely truthful. They simply never asked another question, and I never volunteered one. Linda Harper seemed especially bothered by people she could not easily categorize. She liked knowing every occupation, every schedule, every renovation, and every personal detail inside the neighborhood. Information, at least in her mind, was another form of authority. She often stood outside during afternoon walks carrying her clipboard, greeting some homeowners warmly while studying others with careful attention. Whenever our paths crossed, I remained polite, nodded respectfully, and continued home without inviting conversation. That quiet behavior seemed to frustrate her more than open disagreement ever could. My weekends looked even simpler. I repaired old furniture in the barn, trimmed overgrown branches, organized family photographs stored in weathered boxes, and spent hours restoring small pieces of the farmhouse instead of replacing them. I believed that preserving history required patience, not perfection. Several neighbors occasionally waved from passing cars, and a few stopped by to admire the old property. They saw an ordinary man living an ordinary life. That was exactly what I wanted them to see. Hidden beneath the folded jacket hanging behind the driver's seat of my truck was a polished black robe that almost nobody outside the courthouse had ever seen me wear. Each morning, after parking in the employee lot, I exchanged dusty work boots for polished dress shoes, slipped into that robe, and quietly stepped into a courtroom where people addressed me very differently than they did inside the neighborhood. Yet the moment court ended each afternoon, I changed back into my simple clothes, climbed into the same old pickup truck, and returned to the farmhouse before sunset. I never carried my title home because I believed respect earned through position should never become part of everyday life. Unfortunately, some people mistake humility for weakness, and Linda Harper was about to build her entire strategy on exactly that misunderstanding. The first certified letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, folded neatly inside an official envelope with the familiar HOA logo stamped across the top corner. According to the notice, my mailbox leaned too far toward the road and no longer matched the approved neighborhood appearance. The suggested correction came with a deadline and a financial penalty if ignored. I walked outside, measured the angle with an ordinary level from my toolbox, smiled quietly to myself, and placed the letter inside a file cabinet that had slowly become dedicated to nothing but HOA correspondence. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. This time my gravel driveway supposedly contained too many loose stones extending beyond the approved property line. The following week, Linda Harper personally appeared while I was trimming bushes near the porch. She stood with her clipboard tucked beneath one arm and carefully photographed my fence from several different angles before informing me that its weathered appearance reduced neighborhood appeal. I thanked her for the information, wished her a pleasant afternoon, and returned to my work without another word. Her expression suggested that my calm response disappointed her far more than an argument ever could. Over the next several months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. There were notices about the color of my storage shed, questions regarding the height of my grass. After a weekend of heavy rain, warnings about an antique wagon wheel displayed beside the barn, and even a complaint that an American flag outside my porch needed replacement because it showed ordinary signs of age after years of respectful display. Every document arrived through certified mail. Every envelope carried official dates and signatures. Every accusation joined the growing collection inside the same locked file cabinet. I never threw away a single page. Instead, I organized everything by date, photographed every envelope before opening it, scanned every document into encrypted cloud storage, and kept printed copies in labeled folders. Years inside the legal system had taught me one lesson that most people discover too late. Patterns matter far more than isolated incidents. Linda seemed convinced that constant pressure would eventually force me to sell the property or surrender to every unreasonable demand. Instead, every new complaint quietly strengthened a timeline that neither she nor anyone else realized was taking shape. Neighbors occasionally asked why I never attended HOA meetings to defend myself. I simply answered that conversations fade, but records remain. Some people laughed politely, believing I had accepted defeat. Others assumed I lacked the confidence to stand up for myself. Linda appeared especially satisfied each time another certified receipt confirmed delivery because she interpreted silence as submission. She never imagined silence could also be discipline. Even after long days at the courthouse, I returned home, changed back into work clothes, repaired old fence posts, watered the garden, and updated my records before dinner. My scanner became as routine as my coffee maker. Every photograph received a date stamp. Every conversation was summarized immediately after it ended while details remained fresh in my memory. Security cameras quietly watched the driveway, the mailbox, the porch, and the entrance to the barn, automatically uploading recordings to secure cloud storage every evening without requiring any attention from me. From the outside, nothing about my life appeared unusual. Linda saw only an isolated homeowner surrounded by paperwork and old buildings. I saw a complete chronology forming one document at a time, waiting patiently for the day when facts would become far more valuable than opinions. The investigation began quietly, almost invisibly, while the neighborhood remained busy repeating Linda Harper's version of events. Within 24 hours of the fire, a county fire marshal arrived with a camera, measuring tools, and a notebook that quickly filled with observations. He never rushed to conclusions, never accepted rumors as evidence, and never seemed interested in the conversations happening beyond the yellow safety tape surrounding my property. That professionalism immediately earned my respect. An insurance investigator followed later that afternoon, carefully photographing everything that remained of the farmhouse, documenting structural damage, cataloging personal property, and asking detailed questions about the timeline leading up to the fire. I answered every question with complete honesty, provided copies of my homeowner's insurance policy, and handed over the organized folders containing months of certified HOA notices. Neither investigator commented on the documents immediately, but both paused long enough to recognize that they represented something much larger than ordinary neighborhood disagreements. While the official investigation moved forward, Linda continued building a very different narrative. She spoke confidently to neighbors during evening walks, insisting that years of carelessness had finally caught up with me. She implied that repeated HOA violations reflected a pattern of irresponsibility rather than simple disagreements over community rules. I overheard fragments of those conversations while collecting mail from the temporary mailbox the Postal Service installed near the road. Some people offered sympathetic smiles when they saw me. Others avoided eye contact completely, uncertain which story they should believe. I never tried to persuade anyone. Public opinion changes quickly, but documented facts move at their own steady pace. 3 days after the fire, I received a request from the insurance company asking whether the property had any electronic security systems before the incident. I answered with a simple yes and explained that multiple exterior cameras monitored the driveway, porch, mailbox, barn, and surrounding yard 24 hours a day. More importantly, every recording had been configured years earlier to upload automatically into encrypted cloud storage at the end of each day. The farmhouse itself had been destroyed, but the recordings had never been inside the house. They had been safely preserved somewhere far beyond the reach of smoke, weather, or damaged equipment. The investigator looked up from his notes with noticeably greater interest and asked whether I could provide access to the archived footage. I quietly agreed and scheduled a secure transfer through my attorney. That moment felt significant, although I kept my emotions carefully under control. Experience had taught me that evidence should always speak before people do. Over the following week, additional requests arrived for photographs, maintenance records, insurance inventories, property surveys, and copies of every communication between me and the homeowners association. Fortunately, every document had already been scanned, dated, and organized long before anyone imagined an investigation would become necessary. What many people considered an unusual habit of keeping meticulous records suddenly became one of the strongest assets available to establish the truth. Meanwhile, Linda continued appearing confident whenever local reporters visited the neighborhood, speaking as though the final outcome had already been decided. She believed public certainty could outweigh patient investigation. I knew something entirely different. Inside every courtroom where I had ever served, assumptions eventually surrendered to evidence, and evidence had already begun telling a story that no rumor could erase. The investigation gathered momentum one carefully verified fact at a time, and for the first time since the fire, I could sense the balance beginning to shift. My attorney called early one morning to tell me that the insurance investigators had completed their initial review of the cloud-backed security recordings. They wanted additional footage covering the weeks leading up to the fire rather than only the day itself. That request told me everything I needed to know. They were no longer examining a single unfortunate incident. They were looking for a pattern. I authorized full access to every archived recording, every date-stamped photograph, and every digital log stored on my secure backup system. Within days, investigators matched camera footage with delivery records, certified mail receipts, and property inspection dates. Every time Linda Harper or another HOA representative appeared near my property, the timeline became more complete. Nothing dramatic happened in those recordings. There were no theatrical confrontations or emotional arguments. Instead, there was something much more persuasive. There was consistency. The cameras quietly documented repeated visits, routine inspections, photographs being taken, notices being delivered, and my ordinary daily routine. Facts accumulated without emotion, exactly the way reliable evidence should. At the same time, several neighbors who had remained silent during the earliest days of the investigation agreed to speak with investigators. One remembered seeing HOA representatives lingering near my mailbox long after delivering certified letters. Another recalled overhearing conversations suggesting that continued pressure might eventually convince me to abandon the property altogether. None of those statements alone proved wrongdoing, but together they established context that investigators considered important. The insurance company also confirmed that I had maintained the farmhouse responsibly for years, with regular inspections, updated electrical records, and documented maintenance. That finding directly contradicted the rumors suggesting I had neglected the property. Quietly, the narrative that Linda had built began developing visible cracks. The county fire marshal requested one final meeting with my attorney and me to review several technical findings before issuing his official report. He remained careful with every word, refusing to speculate beyond the evidence already collected, but his confidence in the documented timeline was impossible to miss. Before leaving, he reminded us that professional investigations depend upon verified facts rather than neighborhood opinions. I appreciated that sentence more than he probably realized. A few days later, the county prosecutor's office notified my attorney that enough verified information existed to move the legal process forward. Formal proceedings would allow every document, recording, witness statement, and investigative report to be evaluated under established legal standards instead of public speculation. Meanwhile, Linda continued walking through the neighborhood with the same polished confidence she had displayed from the beginning, greeting neighbors as though nothing had changed. She still believed appearances carried more weight than documentation. She still assumed that the quiet homeowner she had spent months pressuring would eventually disappear into the background. She never imagined that every certified letter she had proudly mailed, every inspection she had carefully documented, and every public statement she had confidently repeated had become pieces of a much larger record. As I closed the final evidence binder that evening, my attorney placed a sealed envelope on the table. Inside was an official court notice establishing the schedule for the upcoming proceedings. I looked at the date for several quiet seconds before carefully returning the document to its envelope. Linda believed she was preparing for another ordinary hearing involving an ordinary homeowner. I knew that when the courthouse doors opened, the greatest surprise waiting inside would not be hidden in any evidence folder. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of quiet that only exists before a life-changing day. I woke before sunrise out of habit rather than anxiety, brewed a fresh pot of coffee in the temporary rental house where I had been staying since the fire, and reviewed the same evidence binder one final time. Every certified letter remained in chronological order. Every photograph carried its original date stamp. Every security recording had already been authenticated and copied for the court. My attorney called shortly after 6 o'clock to confirm that everything had been filed correctly and reminded me that another judge had been assigned to hear every matter related to the fire in order to preserve complete impartiality. That arrangement had been made immediately after the case entered the court system, exactly as judicial ethics required. I appreciated the decision because fairness has never depended upon appearances. It depends upon procedure. I placed the binder inside my old leather briefcase, folded my dark suit neatly across the passenger seat of my pickup truck, and began the familiar drive toward the county courthouse. The roads looked exactly as they had thousands of mornings before, yet I knew this day would be remembered very differently. Traffic remained light. The American flag outside the courthouse moved gently in the morning breeze, and employees entered through the same secure entrance they used every weekday. I parked in my assigned space, greeted the courthouse security officers by name, and walked through the employee hallway without drawing attention from anyone who worked there. It was simply another workday to them. Inside my chambers, I changed from my ordinary clothes into the black judicial robe that had remained carefully pressed in my office closet. I reviewed the docket for the unrelated civil matters assigned to me that morning, signed several routine administrative orders, and prepared for a short session that had absolutely nothing to do with my own legal dispute. Professional responsibilities always came first. Less than an hour later, I stepped through the door leading toward my courtroom. Conversations immediately softened as attorneys organized their files and litigants stood respectfully while court came into session. I completed each scheduled matter with the same calm attention I had given every case throughout my career. Evidence was reviewed, motions were decided, and orders were entered without delay. When the final case on my morning calendar concluded, I thanked everyone for their professionalism, adjourned the session, and returned to my chambers to remove the robe. A courthouse employee informed me that the courtroom assigned to the fire proceedings was already filling with attorneys, investigators, insurance representatives, witnesses, and several curious residents from my neighborhood. Carrying only my briefcase, I walked through the public hallway toward that courtroom. Before I reached the entrance, I noticed Linda Harper standing beside her attorney reviewing documents with complete confidence. She looked up casually, expecting to see the same quiet homeowner she had dismissed for months. Instead, her eyes shifted from my face to the robe folded neatly across my arm, then toward the courtroom I had just exited. The expression on her face changed instantly from certainty to stunned disbelief as courthouse staff greeted me with the quiet respect reserved for a colleague. No one needed to explain who I was. The building itself had already answered the question she had never thought to ask. The moment Linda Harper recognized what the courthouse staff already knew, the confidence she had carried for months quietly dissolved. She did not speak immediately. She simply stared as another judge stepped into the courtroom assigned to the fire case, while I remained outside with my attorney, waiting exactly where every other party was expected to wait. That distinction mattered. I had never intended to hear my own case, and I never could have under the ethical rules that govern my profession. My responsibility as a judge ended the moment I finished my unrelated morning docket. From that point forward, I stood before the legal system in exactly the same position as any other homeowner seeking a fair hearing. Linda slowly turned toward her attorney and whispered something I could not hear. He looked briefly in my direction, then quietly answered her while flipping through his notes. Whatever confidence they had carried into the building was now being replaced by uncertainty. Inside the courtroom, the assigned judge called the case, confirmed that every party understood the proceedings, and carefully explained that all evidence would be evaluated solely according to the law and the documented record. That opening statement set the tone for everything that followed. My attorney presented the organized timeline. Beginning months before the fire, every certified HOA letter appeared in chronological order. Every delivery receipt matched a corresponding document. Every property photograph carried authenticated dates. The security camera recordings were introduced through the proper witnesses who verified how the cloud backup system preserved the files automatically. Investigators explained their methods with calm professionalism, answering every question directly without exaggeration or speculation. The county fire marshal testified about the physical findings gathered during the investigation, remaining careful to distinguish verified observations from unsupported assumptions. The insurance investigator described the maintenance records, inspection history, and documentation showing that the farmhouse had been responsibly cared for over many years. One by one, the neighbors who had agreed to testify described what they had personally observed rather than repeating rumors. Their statements were measured, consistent, and limited to facts they could honestly verify. As the evidence accumulated, the story that had circulated through the neighborhood became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the documented record. Linda's attorney challenged several points, as any capable attorney should, but each challenge was answered with another authenticated document, another dated photograph, another verified report, or another witness whose testimony matched the existing timeline. I remained silent unless asked a direct question. Years on the bench had taught me that credibility is strengthened by restraint rather than performance. Throughout the hearing, I noticed several neighbors sitting quietly in the gallery. These were the same people who had watched Linda accuse me beside the smoking remains of my home only weeks earlier. Their expressions had changed completely. They were no longer watching a dispute between an HOA president and a quiet homeowner. They were watching a careful legal process separate assumptions from evidence. By the end of the day, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt entirely different from the one that had existed outside my burned farmhouse. Rumors had dominated the beginning of this story, but inside that courtroom, every opinion surrendered to documented facts, and for the first time since the fire, the truth no longer needed anyone to defend it. The final stage of the proceedings unfolded with the quiet confidence that only well-documented facts can create. By then, the courtroom no longer revolved around speculation or first impressions. Every important question was answered by a record, a witness, or a verified report rather than emotion. The assigned judge carefully reviewed the complete chain of evidence, taking time to confirm that every document had been properly authenticated and every exhibit had been introduced according to the rules of procedure. My attorney summarized the timeline beginning with the first certified HOA notice months before the fire and ending with the preservation of the cloud-backed security recordings that survived because they had been stored remotely long before the farmhouse was destroyed. Each piece connected naturally to the next, forming a complete picture that required no exaggeration. The county fire marshal confirmed that his investigation relied entirely upon physical findings collected at the property and laboratory analysis rather than neighborhood rumors. The insurance representatives explained that my maintenance history, inspection records, and policy documentation consistently reflected responsible ownership over many years. Digital specialists verified the integrity of the archived security footage, explaining how the automatic cloud backup preserved original timestamps without alteration. Those technical details might have sounded ordinary to some people sitting in the gallery, but inside a courtroom, they carried tremendous weight because reliability matters far more than dramatic storytelling. Linda Harper's attorney continued presenting arguments on her behalf, but each attempt to challenge the documented timeline encountered another carefully preserved record that supported the existing sequence of events. Even the certified HOA letters that had once been intended to pressure me became important exhibits because they established an undisputed history of repeated interactions between the association and my property. Several neighbors later admitted that they had formed opinions too quickly after hearing only one version of the story. Watching the hearing changed their perspective because they finally saw the difference between assumptions shared in casual conversation and evidence examined under legal standards. Throughout the proceedings, I remained exactly where my role required me to be, answering questions only when requested and allowing the legal process to function without interruption. I never mentioned my judicial position because it no longer mattered. Inside that courtroom, I was simply another citizen relying upon the same legal protections available to everyone else. That realization seemed to affect several people more deeply than any dramatic speech could have. When the assigned judge concluded the evidentiary phase and announced the court's findings based upon the documented record, the atmosphere inside the courtroom became remarkably still. The decision reflected the evidence presented rather than the rumors that had spread through the neighborhood in the days following the fire. Linda's confidence quietly disappeared as she realized that influence inside a homeowners association could not outweigh authenticated documents, professional investigations, and established legal procedure. As people slowly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, a few neighbors approached me with respectful handshakes and brief apologies for believing conclusions before the investigation had been completed. I accepted every apology with gratitude because resentment had never been my objective. The purpose of the legal system is not to humiliate people. It is to examine facts patiently until the truth becomes clear. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt no desire for celebration because the greatest victory had never been proving someone wrong. It had been proving that careful preparation, quiet discipline, an unwavering respect for the law could withstand even the loudest accusations. Several months later, the empty stretch of blackened ground had become something entirely different. The new farmhouse stood on the same foundation where generations of my family had once gathered, built with stronger materials, modern safety features, and the same wide front porch that had always welcomed the evening sunset. The old oak tree still overlooked the property, its branches casting familiar shadows across freshly planted grass, as though quietly reminding me that some things survive every hardship. Each morning I followed nearly the same routine I had before the fire. I brewed coffee before sunrise, walked the property line, checked the fence, and listened to birds returning to the trees that surrounded the rebuilt home. The difference was not the house. The difference was the perspective. I no longer worried about rumors because I had seen how quickly they disappeared when measured against verified facts. Life inside the neighborhood gradually settled into a quieter rhythm as well. New families moved in, children rode bicycles through the streets again, and conversations slowly shifted away from old accusations toward ordinary community life. Linda Harper was rarely the center of those conversations anymore. People had learned an unforgettable lesson about accepting confident opinions before waiting for complete information. Some neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped to wave during evening walks or ask how the rebuilding process was progressing. Their kindness did not erase the past, but it demonstrated something important. Communities recover when people choose honesty over assumption. My professional life also returned to its familiar routine. Each weekday, I drove the same old pickup truck to the courthouse, entered through the employee entrance, exchanged work clothes for my judicial robe, and presided over cases with the same commitment to fairness that had guided me throughout my career. If anything, the experience deepened my appreciation for every person who entered a courtroom hoping that facts would matter more than appearances. Whenever I looked across the bench at someone waiting to be heard, I remembered exactly how it felt to stand on the other side of the process, trusting that patience and evidence would eventually overcome misunderstanding. Back at home, one shelf inside my study held a single organized portfolio containing the certified HOA letters, investigation reports, insurance records, authenticated photographs, and copies of the court filings. I never opened it out of bitterness. I kept it because it represented the value of preparation, discipline, and truth. Every page reminded me that small details collected consistently over time can become the strongest foundation a person has when difficult moments arrive. Friends occasionally asked whether I wished everything had happened differently. Of course I did. No one wants to lose a family home filled with memories. Yet I also understood that character is often revealed most clearly when circumstances become unfair. I never needed revenge, public applause, or dramatic confrontation. I only needed the legal system to function exactly as it was designed to function. Looking across the rebuilt porch one quiet evening as the American flag moved gently in the summer breeze, I realized that the greatest victory had never been surprising someone with my profession. The real victory was proving that humility is not weakness, silence is not surrender, and justice does not become stronger by speaking louder. It becomes stronger when ordinary people refuse to abandon the truth, preserve the facts with patience, and trust that integrity, when given the opportunity to stand on its own, will always speak clearly enough.